I knew something was off the moment I saw the envelope. It was a plain, white thing, taped to my front door like a warning shot. No postage, no handwriting. Just a neatly typed letterhead, stamped with the name of the Rosewood Lakes Homeowners Association, and, beneath it, a name I'd already heard whispered by my new neighbors in the cautious tones people reserve for natural disasters and IRS audits. Margaret Ellison, HOA President. I peeled it off the door, still holding my coffee in one hand. The paper crinkled as I unfolded it, and my eyes skimmed the words. Violation notice, failure to store trash cans within regulation timeframe. Fine. $75. I frowned. My trash pickup had been yesterday. The can was back in my garage by noon. What the hell was this? A sharp knock on the door made me look up. Through the peephole, I caught sight of a stiff bob of honey blonde hair and a pastel cardigan. I exhaled slowly. Might as well get this over with. When I pulled the door open, Margaret Ellison stood before me, smiling in that way that wasn't actually a smile at all. Teeth bared, lips too tight, like she was holding back something sour. She had the air of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being right, and she had no intention of breaking that streak today. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," she said, voice clipped and pleasant in the way a guillotine was precise. "I assume you've read the notice?" I folded my arms. "Just did. Seems like a mistake. My trash was put away on time." Margaret's expression didn't change. "I have photographic evidence that it was still on the curb at 7:42 a.m. I stared at her. "Pickup is between 7 and 8. "Exactly," she said primly. "Our regulations state that all trash receptacles must be removed from the curb no later than 7:30. You were 12 minutes late, hence the fine." I let out a disbelieving laugh. "You seriously ticketed me over 12 minutes? Margaret tilted her head, her gaze cool. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Callahan. Without order, we have chaos." "Chaos? Over a trash can?" I kept my temper in check and met her gaze evenly. "I just moved in. A warning would have been more reasonable." She smiled again, the kind of smile that told me she was enjoying this. "The HOA does not issue warnings for clear violations. Fines are automatic." I could feel my patience thinning. "Right. And what happens if I don't pay?" Margaret's expression darkened, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. "Unpaid fines accrue additional penalties, which can result in property liens. But I'm sure a law-abiding resident like yourself wouldn't let it come to that." She handed me another paper, a formal notice of lien eligibility for $75 damn dollars. This was insane. I'd heard of HOAs being strict, but this was something else. This woman wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was weaponizing them. I exhaled sharply. "I'll look into it." "Wonderful," Margaret said, voice syrupy sweet. "Enjoy your day, Chief Callahan." She turned on her heel and strolled away down the path. My jaw tightened. She knew. I hadn't told anyone yet, but Margaret must have done her homework. She knew I was the new chief of police. And judging by the way she smirked as she walked off, she was daring me to do something about it. That was the first shot, and it was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the notices started piling up. One for excessively bright porch lighting, my standard LED bulbs, apparently too aggressive for the neighborhood aesthetic. Another for unauthorized mailbox color, identical to my neighbor's, but allegedly a shade too dark. And a third for parking in my own damn driveway. At first I thought it was just me, that maybe I'd moved into a neighborhood with an overzealous board and a president on a power trip. But then I started noticing things. The firefighter across the street, he got a fine for having an unapproved garden hose. The paramedic next door, she was cited for grass being 0.5 inches above regulation height. An off-duty sheriff's deputy, a few houses down, banned from using his own garage gym because it wasn't a sanctioned recreational facility. There was a pattern. Margaret wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was targeting first responders. I started digging. Late, At night, I sat at my desk, going through every HOA violation notice I could get my hands on, dozens of them. And the more I looked, the clearer it became. Margaret wasn't just enforcing rules, she was running a racket, and it all led back to one thing: the tow trucks. Residents' cars were being towed for insane infractions: illegal street parking on their own cul-de-sac, improper tire alignment in their driveways, even violating vehicle aesthetics for having a work truck. Every car was taken by Ellison's Tow and Recovery, a business owned by Margaret's cousin, and the kicker? They weren't just towing. They were impersonating law enforcement, dressing in fake uniforms with badges, showing up in blacked-out trucks with flashing lights, acting like they had the authority to seize vehicles. They were charging homeowners upwards of $500 just to get their cars back. I gritted my teeth. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This was extortion, and Margaret Ellison thought she was untouchable. I wasn't the kind of man to act without a plan. That's how you lose. So I started gathering evidence. I documented every shady fine, every fraudulent tow, every homeowner's complaint. I spoke to victims, recorded statements, got my hands on bank records, transaction logs, and the golden ticket, a leaked HOA email chain where Margaret explicitly discussed targeting certain residents. It was enough to bury her, but I wasn't going to stop there. No, I was going to bring her down in front of everyone, and when I was done, she'd wish she never taped that envelope to my door. The next morning, I woke up to find my truck missing. For a split second, I thought it had been stolen. Then I spotted the Ellison's Tow and Recovery business card taped to my mailbox like a calling card from a serial killer. A sinking, simmering rage settled in my gut. I checked my Ring camera. Sure enough, at exactly 2:14 a.m., two men in black uniforms, badges, clipped to their chests, rolled up in an unmarked tow truck. No sirens, no flashing lights. They worked fast, hooking up my truck and rolling out in under 3 minutes. Professionals. I scrolled through the footage until I found what I was looking for. One of the men stepping into frame, turning slightly toward my camera, just enough to catch the patch on his fake uniform. It read, HOA Compliance Officer. I let out a slow breath. They weren't just impersonating cops. They were pretending to be a law enforcement arm of the HOA. I should have seen this coming. Margaret had tested me with the fines, waiting to see how I'd react. When I didn't fight back immediately, she escalated. I glanced at the fine print on the business card. Immediate. Payment required, $6.25 impound fee. They were ramping up the pressure, hoping I'd cave and play by their rules. I was done playing. At precisely 8 a.m., I walked into Ellison's Tow and Recovery. It was exactly what I expected. Cheap plastic chairs, flickering fluorescent lights, and a young receptionist who didn't bother looking up from her phone. I dropped the notice of impoundment onto the counter. I'm here for my truck. She barely glanced at it. $625, cash or card? I leaned forward. Actually, I'd like to speak to the owner. Her eyes flicked up then, scanning me for a second before she pursed her lips. Mr. Ellison doesn't take walk-ins, I smiled. That's fine, I'll wait. She hesitated. I could feel the moment she recognized my name. I wasn't just another pissed-off resident. I was the chief of police. She fumbled for the phone. One moment. Minutes later, the back office door swung open. A stocky man in his 50s, Gerald Ellison, stepped out, arms crossed. He had that permanently sunburnt, chain-smoking tow guy look, sweaty polo, cheap cologne trying to cover up something worse. Mr. Callahan, he said, forcing a smile. What seems to be the problem? I held up the printed still from my Ring footage, the image of his employee in a fake HOA compliance officer uniform. Let's start with this, I said. Impersonating law enforcement is a felony. Gerald's expression didn't flicker. That's just a uniform, a courtesy for the neighborhood. Courtesy, I repeated. You mean intimidation? He shrugged. People don't argue when they think it's official. I let that hang in the air. He didn't even try to deny it. I tapped the impound notice, and the reason for my truck being towed. Gerald feigned a wince. Unapproved commercial vehicle in a residential area? I stared at him. It's a standard Ford F-150. He grinned. Well, you know how strict the HOA is. I exhaled through my nose. He was baiting me, waiting for me to lose my temper. I gave him nothing, just a small, easy smile. I'll be getting my truck back now. 625. He repeated. I pulled out my wallet, slid my police ID onto the counter. Or you can release it now, and I won't start pulling footage for an impersonation and racketeering investigation. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something behind his eyes. He wasn't afraid of me, yet. But he was thinking, calculating. Then, just like that, the smile was back. Well, we don't want any trouble. I'll waive the fee just this once. He gestured to the lot. A few minutes later, a mechanic pulled my truck around. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at Gerald, still watching me from the doorway. He wasn't worried, which meant one thing. He thought Margaret had him covered. That night, I had dinner at Dan's place. Dan was a fire captain, one of the first people I met when I moved in. He poured me a drink as I laid out everything I had so far. The fines, the fake uniforms, the tow scam. By the time I finished, Dan was shaking his head. You're not the first one to notice, but most people don't have the power to do anything. I swirled my drink. How deep does it go? Dan sighed. Margaret's been running this HOA for almost 8 years. At first it was little things, extra fees, arbitrary rules. Then she started bullying people into moving, claiming they were in violation until they just gave up and sold their houses. She'd get her friends to buy the properties cheap. Now, half the HOA board is in her pocket. I clenched my jaw. And the cops before me? Dan gave me a pointed look. Margaret's husband is on the city council. That was it. That was the piece I was missing. She wasn't just powerful in the HOA. She had connections in local government. No wonder. She acted untouchable. I spent the next week doing more digging. I needed more than just suspicion. I needed proof. I called in a favor from an old friend in code enforcement. He found something interesting. The HOA's bylaws had been quietly amended 6 months ago. A clause that allowed Margaret unilateral power to issue fines without board approval. That was illegal. The board wasn't a monarchy. She couldn't just rewrite rules without a vote. I cross-checked it with property records and found another fun surprise. Margaret's husband had purchased 4 houses in the last 2 years, all foreclosures from people who violated HOA rules. She was using the HOA to steal homes. That was the final nail in the coffin. But I still needed one more thing, something public, something undeniable. And then, one night, I got lucky. It was nearly midnight when I got an email, an anonymous tip. It contained an audio recording, grainy but clear enough to recognize Margaret's voice. People like him don't belong here. You know how to handle it. Make sure he understands. There was a pause. Then a man, Gerald maybe, replied. You want us to do it the usual way? Margaret laughed. No, this time we'll make it hurt. I listened to it 3 times. Then I sat back. Margaret wasn't just scamming people. She was planning something, and whatever it was personal. At exactly 3:12 a.m., my doorbell rang. I was already awake. I'd been listening to that recording on repeat, dissecting every word, every pause, every implication. But this was something else. I checked my Ring camera. A man in a black uniform stood on my porch, clipboard in hand. No HOA insignia, no visible ID, just a generic polo, dark jeans, and a smug posture that set my teeth on edge. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. Something I can help you with? The man barely glanced up. Violation notice, mandatory property inspection. I stared at him. "It's the middle of the night," he smirked. "Well, sir, it's been brought to the board's attention that your home may be out of compliance with Rosewood Lakes structural integrity standards." My grip on the doorframe tightened. Structural integrity. See, our bylaws state that homes must be routinely assessed for hazards, and we received a report that your fence may be improperly installed. Now, we wouldn't want your property, a value to suffer because of a potential code infraction, would we? A calculated pause. Then he added, "Refusing inspection will result in an automatic citation, which may result in a lien." I finished flatly. The man grinned. "Glad we're on the same page." I didn't say a word, just let the silence stretch. The grin started to slip. He cleared his throat. "I'll just take a quick look around the perimeter." I let my eyes drift down to his hip. No badge, no gun, no credentials, just a cheap two-way radio hooked to his belt, one of those off-brand models you buy in bulk. This wasn't a code inspector. This was a goon in an HOA costume. Margaret was making her next move. I exhaled slowly, then stepped aside. "Go ahead." He blinked, like he expected a fight, but I wasn't about to give him one. Not yet. I followed him as he walked my property, clipboard in hand, jotting down absolute nonsense. Fence misalignment, possible drainage issue, excessive security cameras. Then he reached my truck. He circled it slowly, tapping his pen against his clipboard. "This still might not meet HOA vehicle aesthetics." I folded my arms. "You already towed it once." He grinned. "Yeah, and we'll do it again." That was it. That was the slip. We, not the HOA. We. This guy wasn't just working for Margaret. He was part of the racket. I let him finish his phony inspection, let him leave without another word. Then I went inside and started making calls. It was time to set the trap. By morning, Margaret had escalated. Again. I opened my email to find a formal HOA disciplinary hearing notice. Urgent. Mandatory hearing for compliance violations. Date. Tomorrow. 7 p.m. Location. Rosewood Lakes Community Center. And the list of infractions. Unpermitted security equipment installation, ring cameras, unauthorized home modification, fence issue fabricated by her goon, non-compliance with HOA, parking standards, my own damn driveway, aggressive behavior toward HOA officials, for existing in my own home apparently. It ended with a warning. Failure to resolve these violations may result in legal action, property, liens, or forced removal from the community. I stared at the email for a long moment, then I smiled. This was it. Margaret thought she was pushing me into a corner, but she had no idea I was holding the blade. The next night, I walked into the Rosewood Lakes Community Center just before 7 p.m. It was packed. Not just the board members, but residents, homeowners who had been fined, harassed, extorted. Margaret had stacked the deck in her favor, expecting a quiet takedown, but she hadn't planned for the entire neighborhood showing up. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, pristine as always, perfectly pressed blouse pearls, a look of absolute confidence. She smiled. "Mr. Callahan, please have a seat." I did. The meeting was called to order. The charges were read. And then Margaret leaned forward, voice thick with mock concern. "I'm sure you understand," she said sweetly, "that our community thrives on order. We simply cannot allow one resident to disregard the rules." I let the silence stretch. Then I leaned back. "I agree." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. I pulled out a stack of documents, copies of her illegal bylaw changes, fraudulent fines, and bank transfers from Ellison's tow and recovery directly into an HOA-controlled account. Then I pulled out my phone and hit play. Margaret's voice filled the room. "People like him don't belong here. You know how to handle it. Make sure he understands." The crowd stirred. I didn't stop there. I looked directly at Margaret and spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "See, I've been doing some digging, and it turns out this hearing, it'd be unlawful. Because under state law, an HOA can't issue punitive actions without an unbiased vote from the board. I turned to the other members, the ones Margaret had bullied, manipulated. You didn't vote, did you? Their silence said everything. Margaret's fingers curled against the table. This is highly inappropriate. No, I said, standing. What's inappropriate is running an illegal tow scam. What's inappropriate is using an HOA as a personal dictatorship. What's inappropriate is threatening homeowners and trying to force them out. Her jaw twitched. You have no proof, I smiled. Oh, but I do. I turned to the crowd. Who here has been unfairly fined? Hands went up. Who here has had their car towed? More hands. I locked eyes with Margaret. And who here is sick of this? A chorus of voices rose. Margaret's mask cracked. She could feel it, the power slipping. Then the doors at the back of the hall swung open. 2 uniformed state investigators stepped inside, and that's when Margaret realized this wasn't just an HOA meeting, it was a public reckoning. Her face went pale. For the first time, she looked afraid, and I wasn't finished yet. Margaret's fingers gripped the edges of the table, knuckles, turning white. The air in the community center had shifted, power slipping from her grasp, the walls closing in. The 2 state investigators walked forward, their presence a dark shadow looming over the room. Their badges caught the light, real ones unlike the cheap knockoffs her goons had been flashing around. Margaret Ellison, one of them, a tall man with an unreadable face, spoke evenly. Margaret's lips parted. She glanced around like a cornered animal, expecting someone, anyone, to step in. But no one did. The board members wouldn't meet her eyes. The homeowners, once silenced by fear, were now watching her fall. She cleared her throat. Her voice wavered. What is the meaning of this intrusion? The investigator pulled out a legal document, unfolding it slowly. Mrs. Ellison, we have reason to believe that the Rosewood Lakes Homeowners Association has been operating under fraudulent financial practices, unauthorized bylaw amendments, and the illegal enforcement of fines and property seizures. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't used to losing. I don't know where you're getting this absurd. We have documented complaints, signed testimonies and financial records that suggest otherwise. The investigator cut her off. Your name is all over the transactions linked to Ellison's Tow and Recovery, a company implicated in fraudulent vehicle seizures under the pretense of law enforcement. I saw it then, the exact moment she realized she had no way out. Her carefully curated world, the empire she had built brick by brick, intimidation by intimidation, was crumbling. I leaned forward, just enough for my voice to carry. You should have stopped at the trash can fine, Margaret. Her eyes snapped to mine, fury flickering through the panic. You did this, I shrugged. You did this to yourself. The investigator kept reading. We're issuing a formal investigation into the Homeowners Association and its board members. Effective immediately, all HOA enforcements, fines and penalties are frozen pending review. Gasps. Whispers. One of the board members, a nervous-looking woman who had clearly been under Margaret's thumb, suddenly found her voice. So, all. The fines, the property liens, null and void, the investigator confirmed. Any homeowners who were financially extorted may file for reimbursement through the state fraud department. Margaret shot up from her chair. You can't do this. The HOA is a private entity. We have jurisdiction over our own. You do, the investigator agreed. Until you violate state and federal laws, then it becomes our jurisdiction. Silence. Thick, choking silence. Margaret's breath hitched. I saw her scan the room again, waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up for her. But this time, no one would. She had ruled by fear, and now fear was a weak foundation to stand on. She turned. To Gerald, her cousin, the last ally she had. "Say something!" But Gerald wasn't an idiot. He'd been sweating since the moment the investigators walked in. He knew exactly what was coming next. Sure enough, the investigator turned his gaze to him. "Mr. Ellison, we also have questions regarding your towing company's business practices, particularly the impersonation of law enforcement." Gerald bolted, or at least he tried. Before he could make it 3 steps, a uniformed officer, one of mine, blocked the exit. "Yeah, no," the officer said flatly. "You're staying." Gerald froze. Margaret let out a small, strangled sound. It was over. By the time it was done, 2 more board members flipped on her to save their own skin. The HOA was dismantled on the spot. No more arbitrary fines, no more illegal towing, no more Margaret's reign of terror. And the best part? She was slapped with a lawsuit from the very homeowners she had tormented. By the time the legal dust settled, Margaret Ellison would be bankrupt, and without the HOA throne to sit on, she was nothing. 3 weeks later, I watched her move out. It wasn't publicized. There was no announcement, no power play. She left at dawn, loading up the last of her possessions into a beat-up moving truck. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, watching as she slammed the door shut. For the first time, she saw me as an equal, not as an opponent, not as an enemy, just as the man who had taken everything from her. She hated it. I raised my coffee in a silent toast. Margaret's face twisted. Then she climbed into the truck and drove away. The street was quiet, peaceful, the way it should have been all along. This HOA was dissolved within a month. Residents celebrated like it was the 4th of July. No more fines, no more harassment, no more fear. A new board was formed, but this time it was run by the people. Dan became the new head, someone the community could trust. And as for me, I stayed right where I was, not because I had to, not because it was my job, but because I wanted to. Margaret had tried to run me out. She failed. This was my home now, and no power-hungry bureaucrat was ever going to change that. One last thing. A few weeks after she left, I got an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no message, just a HOA violation notice for leaving my trash can out too long. I laughed, then I fed it straight into the shredder.